Dramatic incidents would drive home the importance of the Coast Guard in keeping America's harbors safe during wartime. Black Tom was an island in New York Harbor next to Liberty Island. It was a major munitions depot for the northeastern United States. On July 30th, 1916, it was stocked with munitions and firearms bound for Russia. German agents triggered explosions that could be felt as far away as Maryland. Fragments from the explosion lodged in the Statue of Liberty. 7 people died in the attack.
I'm Heather Farley, Deputy Historian for the U.S. Coast Guard. The Coast Guard's duties would continue to grow during the war. In June 1917, the Espionage Act was passed, bestowing upon the Coast Guard the power to protect merchant shipping from sabotage, safeguard waterfront property, supervise vessel movements, and establish anchorages and restricted areas. It also gave the Coast Guard the right to control and remove people aboard ships. Another tragedy would lead to the development of a key Coast Guard post.
On the morning of December 6, 1917, a tremendous blast ripped through the sleepy town of Halifax, Nova Scotia. The French freighter Mont Blanc, carrying 5,000 tons of TNT, collided with the Norwegian steamship Imo in Halifax's outer harbor. When a fire caused by the collision reached the TNT, there was an explosion equal to a small nuclear blast. The Mont Blanc virtually disappeared, and the Imo was thrown ashore by shockwaves. The explosion destroyed 3,000 dwellings, killed more than 1,600 people, and injured 9,000. The Mont Blanc disaster is one of the worst maritime tragedies of all time, and it stirred America's leaders to make sure nothing like this could ever happen in the United States. During World War I, Captain Godfrey L. Carden, commander of the Coast Guard's New York Division, was named Captain of the Port to supervise the safe loading of explosives in New York Harbor. For a period of 1.5 years, more than 1,600 vessels carrying more than 345 million tons of explosives sailed from this port. The captain of the port post was established in other U.S. ports during the war and remains an important post to this day.
In 1918, Carden's division was the largest single command in the Coast Guard. It was made up of over 1,400 officers and men, 4 Corps of Engineers tugs, and 5 harbor cutters. The captain of the port post was established in other U.S. ports during the war and remains an important post to this day.
100 years ago in 1917, as the United States was preparing to enter World War I, Woodrow Wilson signed a bill into law designed to punish interference in American foreign relations and military operations, including through espionage. A century later, the Espionage Act has been repurposed to go after government whistleblowers and anyone who leaks classified information to the press. And if the trend continues, misuse of the law could cripple investigative journalism.
The Espionage Act was passed by Congress to stop espionage, and it's been misinterpreted to catch reporters.
In 1971, James Goodale was general counsel for the New York Times. That was the year that a military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, a top-secret chronicle of America's involvement in Vietnam, to the Times. When the Times began printing those revelations, the Nixon administration sued to prevent their publication. Goodale defended the Times in the Pentagon Papers case.
No one ever thought the Espionage Act could be used against the press until Nixon decided it could. It was a big surprise. And people have forgotten that it was plucked out of the air.
A few hundred miles from the North Pole, American Coast Guards lower depth charges into the pack ice and blast a channel to secret German bases established off the Greenland coast. A longboat pulls away to destroy the radio stations from which the Nazis were sending weather reports to Germany. When the German expeditions installed themselves there, they sneaked in plenty of supplies. Back to the U.S. cutter comes a load of 60 prisoners. They had scuttled their 3 ships before surrendering. No more weather reports for the Nazis. A new center of low depression has set in.
6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into World War II, the Japanese military decided to launch another attack on American territory, the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. The Japanese believed that having control of the Aleutians would protect their northern flank, preventing a U.S. attack on the Japanese home islands from across the northern Pacific. Starting on June 3rd and 4th, 1942, Japanese planes first attacked an American military base at Dutch Harbor on Amaknak Island. Several buildings were destroyed and dozens of soldiers were killed in the bombings. Next, on June 6th, Japanese forces invaded and occupied the island of Kiska, and on June 7th, the island of Attu was taken. Americans were shocked to learn that Japanese forces had taken over sovereign United States soil, and many feared that it was a stepping stone toward an attack against mainland Alaska, or even the U.S. Pacific Northwest. The U.S. military initially paid little attention to the Japanese garrisons on the two islands, as they were still reeling from the Pearl Harbor attack and concentrating on building up forces for other conflicts across the Pacific and the globe. The Americans only conducted occasional bombing runs on the Japanese forces until January 11, 1943, when U.S. forces landed on Amchitka Island, only 50 miles away from Kiska. An airfield was constructed in February for bombing sorties on Kiska, and thousands of troops eventually arrived on the island. In March 1943, the United States Navy had set up a blockade of Kiska and Attu, and on March 26, the naval battle erupted after a Japanese fleet attempted to supply and reinforce the garrison on Attu. It would later be known as the Battle of the Komandorski Islands. The Japanese fleet withdrew after many hours of battle after running low on fuel and ammunition. Also, the Japanese reportedly feared the arrival of U.S. bombers from bases in the Aleutian Islands. The withdrawal of the Japanese fleet ended the resupply of their garrisons on Kiska and Attu, and they were now virtually isolated, with only meager supplies given by the occasional submarine. American forces were now positioned to finally invade and expel the Japanese from the Alaskan islands. On May 11, 1943, the U.S. military began Operation Land Grab, landing 11,000 troops on Attu. The Japanese forces retreated to the high ground, leaving the beach landings unopposed. The United States military expected the operation to last no more than a few days, but the harsh conditions extended the battle for more than 2 weeks. The invading troops were not prepared for the unforgiving Arctic weather and rugged terrain that caused more casualties than enemy fire. Food shortages, frostbite, trench foot, and gangrene added to the misery of the American forces as they crisscrossed the island, fighting small but brutal engagements with the dug-in Japanese troops. By late May, all the Japanese forces were chased to a small corner of the island and trapped by U.S. forces. With complete naval and air superiority of the U.S. military, Japanese forces had little hope of reinforcement. With little food and ammunition remaining, the Japanese commander, Colonel Yamasaki, decided to launch a final frontal charge into the U.S. lines. On May 29th, before daybreak, the whole Japanese force ran wildly through the U.S. lines, some even eventually reaching shocked American support troops in the base camp. By the next day, the Japanese troops on the island were virtually wiped out, with only 28 prisoners taken alive. 2,351 Japanese troops were buried in mass graves, with many hundreds more believed buried in the hills. Colonel Yamasaki was among the dead. It was one of the
By mid-1944, Japan is getting hit on a daily basis from B-29 bombers. They are literally obliterating cities. Japan was dying. And Japan's only reaction to this is to strike back. Japan is faced with a serious problem. They can't develop a high-tech weapon. Perhaps a low-tech weapon, like a balloon, could be launched against America. They develop a technology that is absolutely brilliant. Simple in its approach, but the technical ability of this bomb to be able to float to America and on its way be controlled by a series of sandbags that gets it to its target is incredible.
Someone had to sit down and run the numbers to come up with exactly how many sandbags, exactly how far they could project the balloon to move. And I find that to be pretty incredible.
Over 1,000 were launched. They went as far as Texas, and as long as they stayed airborne, they could carry great distances. So depending on the wind and the altitude they maintained, they were falling all over Western America.
In May of 1945, a minister, his wife, and 5 children from their parish were out on an outing near a town called Lakeview, Oregon. The minister was parking the car, he let his wife out and the children. They went into the forest. He heard her exclaim, "Look what we've found." And seconds later, by the time he got up there, his wife, who was pregnant at the time and only 26 years old, and these 5 children were dead.
It's tragic to think just how unlucky this family was.
The only known deaths in the continental United States caused by the enemy during World War II.
The wrong place, the wrong time, and the innocent curiosity that went horribly wrong.
There are still balloons out there, obviously. Of the thousands they sent over, less than 1,000 have been discovered. So you have to think that in the massive forests of the Pacific Northwest, Canada, Washington, Oregon, there are some balloons out there.
If you're hiking in the Northwest, be a little careful. And if you see an element like a wheel with teeth on it, that's the sharp end of a disaster awaiting you, as it can explode. They're still there. They're still waiting to be found.
There's a story you once told, and it had to do with World War II. And you were once...
I know the one about the dentist.
Yes, this thing
True.
is stranger than fiction.
Well, it's true. To make it short, I had some dental work to be done. You know, they put in temporary fillings, and I had never had it done before. What is it? Lead?
I think in those days they were putting in temporary lead fillings.
Yeah. It was quite a while ago.
During the war.
Yeah. And
World War II.
Yes. And I had several, upper and lower. And I went to work that day, and I got home very late. And it was, I don't remember what year, but it was after they had taken the Japanese out of California and unfortunately put them in the camps, which was a very sad time in California. And we were all on our guard, you know, about many things. There had been a Japanese submarine sighted in Santa Barbara, and a Japanese fighter plane had been sighted going over our home one evening. It was touchy times. Anyway, this particular night was about 1:15, and I was driving alone. I had 35 miles to drive, and it wasn't any fun. It was just a normal night. I wasn't frightened or anything. I was just driving along, and a road that I'd taken many times, and all of a sudden, I heard music. But I mean, with a great beat, you know, and I looked down to turn off my radio, and it wasn't on. And I turned around and looked to see if there's anyone behind me. And the music was getting louder and louder and louder, and I realized it was in my mouth. And it was beating in my ears. I could hear the tune and everything. I recognized the tune. And then it started to fade out.
Yeah.
And I thought, what the hell was that, you know? What could it possibly be? And I didn't know what it was. So the next day I mentioned it at the studio to Buster Keaton. And he said, what street were you on, Moore Park? And I said, yes. He said, you went by the radio station. You picked it up. Well, you got any fillings? I said, yes. He said, you picked it up in your teeth. But about 5 nights later, because I had to wait, I don't know, a couple weeks for those teeth that were getting fixed, I was going up another street, almost home, and I was passing 4 vacant lots that were all raised so they could build the Birmingham Hospital. And as I went by there, I heard, and I'm picking it up with my teeth.
You mean?
Yes. And I stopped the car. Then I looked around, in the Morse code, like. And I backed the car up, and it got stronger and stronger, and I kept on backing it up until it really got strong, and my whole jaw was vibrating, like this. And then I got the hell out of there. I went boom, like this, because it was very late. And I couldn't wait to get back to MGM the next morning and tell the security office, and they found an underground Japanese transmitting
radio station.
Radio station. Honest to God.
That is that a great story?
No,
but they really,
yeah.
And they captured them, and you helped.
I don't know what happened to them. I just turned it over.
Let's have a look at those teeth that helped win the war.